Hey everyone, welcome back to the next chapter of The Midnight Gang. Chapter 6, Up to No Good. Tom had had some humiliating things happen to him at his school over the years. There was the time when his shorts split while he was doing gymnastics. His clay spun off the wheel in pottery class and hit his art teacher on the face, sending her flying. He bent over to pick a book up from the floor in the library and he blew off loudly. He left the toilet cubicle with the toilet roll trailing from the back of his trousers. He was in the school cafeteria and he slipped on some gravy and landed headfirst in a blancmange. He was holding his violin the wrong way round in the music class, wondering why he wasn't making a sound until he realised the strings were facing down. Some of the older boys hid his games kit so he had to play rugby in his pants. He had to put on a tight-fitting all-in-one bodysuit with a tail stuck to his bottom. He was meant to be a cat and had to sing and dance for a production of the musical Cats. He thought it might be a trick question when his maths teacher asked him what 2 plus 2 was, so he answered 5. Chalk dust set off a sneezing fit and he sneezed right in the headmaster's face, covering Mr. Thews in snot. But now here he was, standing in the middle of a hospital ward, wearing a pink frilly nightdress. "It fits you perfectly," laughed Matron. Once again it was only her that was laughing. Then she checked her watch, which was pinned to her uniform. 1 minute past 8. Way past all your bedtimes. Right, children, lights out. Matron began to march in the direction of her office at the end of the ward. As if they were all playing Grandma's Footsteps, she suddenly turned around after a few paces to see if any of the children had moved. Then she did it again and again. Matron gave one last swivel-eyed look at the children before switching off the light. Click! The ward descended into darkness. Tom hated the dark. He was relieved that some light came from the giant clock face of the Houses of Parliament not far away from the hospital across the rooftops of London. People called the clock tower Big Ben after the huge bell inside it that chimed every hour. Bong! The light from the clock face glowed eerily through the tall windows. There was also a small desk lamp in Matron's office. The lady that sat there behind the glass, staring out into the gloom. She was scanning the beds in the children's ward for any sign of movement. Silence. Then, out of the silence, Tom heard a sound. It was the sound of a tin opening. Then followed the sound of paper rustling, but not just any paper. It sounded like the crinkly silver paper that sweets are wrapped in. Then Tom heard the sound of munching. Tom hadn't eaten since lunchtime, and he had barely eaten his lunch as school dinners were so disgusting. Today it had been liver and boiled beetroot, followed by stewed rhubarb. Lying there on his hospital bed, Tom could feel his tummy rumbling. When he heard another sweet being unwrapped and another, he couldn't help calling out softly in the dark. "Please, can I have one?" "Shh!" came a voice back. Tom was pretty sure it was coming from George's bed. "Please," whispered Tom. "They haven't eaten for ages." "Shh!" came another voice. "Any louder and you'll get us all into trouble." "I only want one," said Tom. The boy must have spoken too loudly, as at that moment, click! The lights in the children's ward flickered back on. Blinking at the brightness, Tom could make out Matron rushing out of her office. "There is no talking after lights out," she shouted. "Now, who was talking?" All the children remained silent. "You must tell me now who was talking, or you will all be in deep, deep trouble." She scanned the ward for signs of anyone cracking under pressure. She looked to George, who looked guilty. "Was it you, George?" she demanded. George shook his head. "Speak up, boy." Even from across the room, Tom could tell George's mouth was full. George tried to speak, but because of the large quantity of chocolate in his mouth, he couldn't form the words. He murmured. "What have you got in your mouth?" George shook his head and tried to say nothing, but it came out as Matron approached his bed like a crocodile stalking its prey. "George, You are meant to be on a strict diet after your operation, but you are scoffing chocolates again, aren't you?" George shook his head. The lady whipped back his bedsheet to reveal a large tin of chocolates. The tin was huge. It was the kind that your family might receive at Christmas and would last until the following Christmas. "You greedy boy," said Matron. "These are confiscated." With that, she snatched the tin from his hands and whipped a tissue from a nearby box. "Now spit out the one you have in your mouth." Reluctantly, the boy did so. "Who sent you these?" she demanded. "I know it couldn't be your father. I am not sure they are allowed chocolates in prison." Tom could tell George was angry, but the boy was doing his best to keep it in. "They came from my local newsagent," replied George. "I'm his favourite customer." "I bet you are. Look at the size of you." "You see, he knows I love these chocolates the most." "What is this stupid man's name?" "Raj," replied George. "Raj what?" "Raj, the newsagent." "I mean, what's his surname, you foolish child?" "Dunno." "Well, I will try to trace him, and with any luck have his shop closed down. After your operation you are forbidden from eating chocolates, George." "Sorry, Matron." "Sorry isn't good enough. The hospital principal, Sir Quentin Strillers, will be told about you defying doctor's orders like this, George." "Yes, Matron," answered the boy sorrowfully. "I will deal with you in the morning. Now go to sleep, all of you." Matron stalked back towards her office. Once again, like Grandma's footsteps, she turned round several times to check the children were still as statues. Click! The lights went off again, and Matron sat in her office. After a moment, the lady did the most incredible thing. She opened the tin and started scoffing the chocolates herself. Matron seemed to quite like the big purple wrapped ones the best, as she made her way through them at quite a pace. She had barely popped one into her mouth when the next one was already being unwrapped, ready for scoffing. Time passed, and the more she ate, the sleepier she became. By 9 o'clock, her eyelids were flickering. Still, she ate and ate and ate. Perhaps she hoped the sugar in the chocolates would keep her awake. Strangely, they seemed to be having the opposite effect. By 10 p.m, her eyes were closing for a few seconds at a time. Still, she ate and ate and ate. By 11 p.m, she was desperately trying to prop up her head in her hands, but it was becoming heavier and heavier and heavier. The scoffing slowed down too, and soon the chocolate mush dribbled out of her mouth and her head hit her desk with a loud thud. Through the glass, Matron could be heard snoring. The children on the ward all remained silent for a moment. Then out of the darkness someone whispered, "Well done, George." "I think the plan's working," he whispered back. George's Cockney accent made his voice stand out. "What plan?" asked Tom. "Shh," came another voice. "Go to sleep, new boy. Stop poking your nose into other people's business," said a girl. "Now, let's all get ready to go at midnight." But of course, Tom couldn't sleep, especially now he knew the children were up to no good. What was going to happen at midnight? Join us again next week for the next story time and a new chapter of The Midnight Gang.